A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. Vengeance and Arm's Length's counter mechanics are mutually exclusive. What this claim talks about is that both of these buffs have a feature where getting attacked causes the attacker to receive some sort of response punishment. For Vengeance, it is simply a counterattack with some potency. For Arm's Length, it is instead the application of an attack speed slowing debuff. The claim is that if you have both buffs up, then only one will be applied to the attacker. This is very easy to test, as you simply have to find a mob that can consistently strike you and use both buffs. Not only are they mutually exclusive, but if Vengeance is active on you, Arm's Length will be entirely incapable of applying its debuff to the target. The reason for the order is difficult to determine, but there is a reasonable chance that the game simply isn't designed to handle multiple different counterattack mechanics firing at the same time. This would also explain why, while Blue Mage has no less than 3 different kinds of this sort of buff, all 3 of them explicitly state this mutual exclusivity. Number 2. Living Shadow's potency is actually greater than the Dark Knight's potency. This one was posed by Silas is Awesome and also originally tested by them. The claim originates from the suggestion that the Living Shadow actually is based on the DPS damage formula as opposed to the tank damage formula. This is already significant because tanks just have a built-in minus 20% to their damage output compared to any other job. This we can somewhat easily test. At level 90, all actions used by the Living Shadow, except the Shadowbringer cast, does exactly 350 potency, or at least it says so. While we don't have an attack with exactly 350 potency on it, we have Heart Slash, which has 170 potency. That means that if the Living Shadow attacks do approximately 106% more damage than Heart Slash, then we do the same damage. Pet potency would suggest that normally your pet should do around 1/6 less damage than you. But if a tank is already doing 20% less, maybe there is something there. For the test, simply repeatedly use Heart Slash to determine the average damage of Heart Slash in your equipment. Then use Living Shadow and take note of the amount of damage each of his attacks do. A little bonus fact is that Esteem does not benefit from the Dark Side buff from Edge of Shadow. Additionally, the damage of the attacks of Esteem before he himself casts Edge of Shadow are the same average damage as the ones before. So we can either assume that he never gets the buff or always has it. Doesn't really change anything for the result. In my case, Heart Slash averages around 4,300 damage per swing. For Esteem to do the same damage as us, 350 potency from him should equate to around 8,800 or 8,900. In reality though, Esteem tends to swing over 10,000, sometimes dipping slightly below, but typically sitting safely above 10,000. If we then assume that Esteem is actually designed to assume 10% damage bonus from Darkside, then we would still expect only around 9,700 and not over 10,000. Knowing that tanks do a strict 20% less damage than other jobs baseline, if we assume that Esteem does not have this disadvantage but is still a pet, then it is worth noting that pet potencies tend between 5/6 and sometimes all the way up to 7/8 of the damage of a player. Obviously, pets actually have partly their own stat lines, so these kinds of examples are more estimates and close enough shorthand values than actual fact. With that said, if Dark Knight didn't have this built-in minus 20% damage, then 350 potency with Dark Side would be closer to 12.2k damage. And Esteem appears to average around 7/8 of that, or a small bit lower, with 7/8 exactly being 10.65k. From that, we can probably conclude the following. Esteem still uses some variety of pet potency. Possibly. Esteem might be designed to assume Dark Side is already active. And Esteem explicitly does not have the downside of the tank passive 20% less damage done. Number 3. The number of people standing in the Magitech terminals in Dzemael Darkhold does not matter. This one is a bit mean actually, because there are 2 variants of these terminals, but they are visually almost identical. The very first terminal you encounter in the dungeon is optional and very big, and actually takes 40 seconds for one person to open. This is actually cut to 20 seconds with 2, 15 seconds with 3, and 10 seconds with 4 players standing on it. All other Magitech terminals in the dungeon instead take 20 seconds with 1 player on them, and 10 with 2. This means that in that awkward room with the terminals next to the crystals, simply having 2 players on the terminal should be the most effective. However, splitting up your team might be problematic if it causes your healer to have to spam heal everyone. Especially because some players think it is safe, sometimes it is, to stand on these terminals during a big AoE pull in the room. Obviously, it is incredibly easy to demonstrate this, you simply have to place the suggested number of players on the platform to test it. Putting 4 players on the supposed 20-second terminals is also a way to demonstrate that they are at minimum duration at 10 seconds. Number 4. When do positionals actually snapshot? Many attacks with positional requirements for bonus damage have rather long wind-ups before the damage actually appears, which poses the original query. The answer to the query is that positionals are snapshotted exactly when the attack animation starts in the first place. The easiest way to test this is with an attack with a rather long wind-up that is spammable and has a significant potency difference with or without positional. For this demonstration, I will use Samurai's Gekko, which outside of combo does 120 potency normally, and 170 from the rear. You can see here that the damage averages around 4.7k when done from behind, it is closer to 3.5k when done from the side. So you can see here that when I initiate Gekko from just barely still behind my target and immediately adjust my position to the side, the damage is still based on being used from behind. This is also somewhat significant in fights where bosses retaliate attacks from certain angles like Ravana. You have to reposition first. Ravana doesn't actually accept moving halfway through the cast, he remembers when you started the attack. Number 5. It's so annoying that Dragoon has to use Disembowel on AoE until level 62. So, Disembowel grants the Dragoon a 10% damage bonus for 30 seconds. But it is a step 2 single target combo attack. At level 62, Sonic Thrust is a step 2 AoE combo attack that also applies this buff. This suggests for a lot of Dragoons that they need this buff active at all times when they are attacking. The problem with this is that it is easily forgotten that the original application of Power Surge has an investment cost of 2 GSDs that will not be Doom Spike, and assuming you want the buff active at all times, you will have to reuse it 12 GSDs later. This gives rise to 3 different possibilities. Option 1 is using True Thrust, Disembowel, and then spamming Doomspike. This is the option below level 50. The second option adds Chaos Thrust and is only at or above level 50. The third option is to simply spam Doomspike. Keep in mind that I am using specifically the potencies of these actions at level 60 for these calculations. Before we get started with the calculations though, I should mention that setting up Disembowel while the mobs are being rounded up tends to be effective, especially if you can't even hit the targeted amount of mobs with Doomspike anyway, so just keep that in mind. Now, math time. Let's say for the first example that there are exactly 3 targets and we assume the fight will be over after 30 seconds, meaning the fight will end just before you would have to cast True Thrust Disembowel again. In that case, using Disembowel to start will lead to a total of 4010 potency. If you also add Chaos Thrust, with correct positional mind you, and the full dot ticking out, which would just barely be possible with the 30-second assumption, then the total potency would be 4285. If you instead only spam Doomspike, then the total potency is only 3960. A notable detail is if the fight ends after only 25 seconds instead, then Doomspike only beats the non-Chaos Thrust option on 3 targets. Now, On 4 targets instead, the Disembowel version does 5220 potency, and the Chaos Thrust version does 5374 potency. Just Doomspike does 5280 potency, meaning that it actually beats the Disembowel variant any day. And on 5 targets, the Disembowel variant does only 6430 potency, the Chaos Thrust variant does 6463, not very much more anymore, and the Just Doomspike option does 6600, which beats both of the options. In other words, unless you're setting up Disembowel while the tank is still pulling, this annoyance of having to use Disembowel on AoE at lower level might not actually be real, just spam Doomspike. There is a little asterisk to this, because obviously you're also going to be using some OGCD options during this, like Jump, Spine Shatter Dive, and Dragonfire Dive, and these of course also benefit from Power Surge. But a lot of the time, you might be able to fire those off with the remains of a Power Surge from a previous fight. And remember, if there are 6 or 7 or 8 targets, then Doomspike spam gets even more overwhelmingly powerful. The problem with setting up Power Surge is that the first 2 GZDs especially just really suck, and after 5 targets, Chaos Thrust also starts to suck. But the overall conclusion is that Disembowel is only really worth setting up before you can AoE properly. Number 6. Running a lot can cause Bahamut to delay Akmorn indefinitely. So this one comes sort of off the back of pet movement and orders from the 3rd episode of this series. Indeed, when you summon Bahamut, he will follow you and refuse to attack until he is next to you. Unless you use Enkindle Bahamut, as then he will simply log on to that target and ignore the fact he isn't near you. If he does waste a lot of time chasing you though, it is worth considering that he will cast exactly 4 worm waves, or at least try to, and those become ready gradually, which means that if Bahamut wastes the first several seconds of the summon attacking nothing, then Bahamut will try his best to rush out as many worm waves as possible once he does start attacking, shooting them out faster than normal. If you order Enkindle Bahamut, he will also cast Akmorn, which does seem to take priority over Wormwave, right? However, if he is unable to reach whoever you're targeting, he will instead try to chase it down. The key here is that Akmorn and Wormwave have an insane 50 yalm range, so the possibility that Bahamut fails to connect once commanded is rather small. If he is able to reach his chosen attack target, then it appears he will not follow you. However, this does mean that if Bahamut falls behind, which is possible in our large AoE pool for example, he might be stuck slowly chasing enemies because he doesn't seem to have the sprint movement speed certainly. Hence why it isn't entirely false or entirely true, because it kind of depends on what you do too. Number 7. Pets don't benefit from targeted buffs. This is a claim that is very well known, so much so that it is unlikely very many players bothered to test it recently. There's a crucially important thing about testing this specific claim that can easily lead you to the wrong conclusion. Most of these kinds of targeted buffs like Dragon Sight amount to around 5% more damage, and to test this, you would have to know how much damage your pet attacks do without the buff and then test again with the buff. The problem here is that you can easily test how much damage your pet's attacks do alone, but you tend to need another player in your party for the actual buff test. It is very easy to forget then that being in a party activates the party bonus effect. For example, if you were to test Bahamut being affected by Dragon Sight, you would need at least yourself, the summoner, and a Dragoon. This would make the party bonus give you 2% more intelligence, which would observably affect the damage of Bahamut, as Bahamut is affected by your intelligence stat, which is why tinctures do affect him, as they simply increase your intelligence in this case. This can give the false impression that Dragon Sight might work on Bahamut if you don't look too closely, as the damage gain will probably be less than 5%, given it is just 2% from party bonus. It is of course a given that the very simple test to do this properly is to be in party with the Dragoon while doing the baseline test of seeing how much damage Bahamut does before you get Dragon Sight, as you need the party bonus to be sure your numbers are correct. After that, you can test and see if Dragonsight affects it. In this rather long testing session I did with Gazel, I managed to land an incredibly low 4359 with Dragonsight, which I had also previously landed without Dragonsight, which suggests that nothing had changed. This same conclusion can be expanded to most, if not all, pets. This also circles back to the Living Shadow claim earlier, that obviously Esteem doesn't get to benefit from your dark side. However, some pseudo-pets like Earthly Star do in fact appear to benefit from personal buffs, so it can be difficult to draw a universal conclusion, although I rue the day that we see the Dragoon place Dragonsight on the Astrologian. Number 8. Physical job abilities all scale with skill speed. Magical job abilities all scale with spell speed. This one was originally tested and proven false by Matthew J. of the Cult of the Pink. The key here is that skill speed name drops affecting damage over time potency of weapon skills, and spell speed name drops affecting the damage over time or healing over time of spells. Neither even as much as mentions abilities. However, dots and hots are known to be affected by speed. The question then is it both for abilities? Or just one of them? Now, an extremely time-consuming approach would be to test every single ability with a dot or a hot in the game to see whether it scales with skill speed or spell speed. But here's a little lesson in math and logic. You only need to produce one example to disprove a claim that says that something applies to everything. So, instead of testing every single ability imaginable with a dot or a hot, we will simply test Aurora and Heart of Corundum, as Matthew J's original test did. Matthew J's test also included some other abilities, however, we will focus on these for this particular claim. First, we need to determine a baseline by having a specific gear set and casting Aurora and Heart of Corundum to see how much they heal for by default. Once we have determined this, we can then add a bunch of skill speed to the set through materia. It is crucial that strength, determination and tenacity stay the same, as otherwise they could impact the result. Then we test Aurora and Heart of Corundum again and observe no change really. Then we replace all of the skill speed materia with spell speed materia. Remember everyone, don't actually put spell speed materia on your tank gear. And then test again. Here, we can actually see that the healing is very slightly greater, which is as expected because the increase from this amount of speed is only a few %. Now, in terms of all the other abilities, based on this observation, my assumption would be that abilities that do physical damage over time, which, by the way, is all physical job abilities that do damage over time, would scale with skill speed. All magical damage over time abilities would then scale with spell speed. Which ones are that, you ask? Doton? Technically. Maybe. I think it's just Doton. And then, finally, all the healing over time abilities might scale with spell speed as demonstrated here. This would mean, obviously, all healer and caster heal over time effects as we know, but with outliers. Aurora, Heart of Corundum, Holy Sheltron, Equilibrium, Shake It Off, Improvisation and Arcane Crest. Although, these I would offer as a test to the viewer if you would like. Obviously, what really matters about this is more that they don't scale with skill speed, because you wouldn't put spell speed on your Reaper now, would you? Please say no. Number 9. Excogitation and Heart of Corundum are considered healing over time. This is of course an obvious follow-up to the demonstration in the prior claim. As demonstrated before, we can observe that Heart of Corundum is considered a healing over time effect simply because it scales specifically with spell speed. Excogitation can be tested in the exact same way. See how much it heals for without a lot of speed, then test again with more speed and see if the difference is significant. And it is. Number 10. Dots and hots exclusively tick every 3 seconds. So this one is of course an exhaustive list and I could go over every single one. However, instead consider that basically all dots and hots have a duration that is a multiple of 3 seconds. This is by design, because the tick rate of these kinds of features in the game happen every 3 seconds. In fact, in the open world, each individual entity can have their own 3-second timer of when they check dots and hots. When entering a dungeon, everything is typically set to the same timer though, meaning that it's not that much about dots and hots and when they tick, and more about when the entity affected bothers to check. This means that if you apply a dot to an enemy, it is equally possible the dot ticks the first time exactly when you place the dot, or nearly 3 seconds later, meaning like 2.99 seconds later or something. And after that, ticks every 3 seconds on the dot. Pun intended. This then poses the follow-up question as to how there exist dots that have weird non-multiple of 3 durations. Do they then tick at a different rate? Nope. Take Mesotes from Sage in PvP. It is a 15-second duration placed AoE that every 3 seconds applies a 5-second debuff to enemies that do 8,000 damage every 3 seconds. This is actually quite weird because it leaves the possibility that it might tick only once in the 5-second duration, right? If it ticks right in the middle? But on the other hand, by making it 5 seconds, it almost guarantees it will tick twice in the 5 seconds, while making sure it doesn't tick 3 times by giving it too long or something. The greatest outliers in this discussion are channeled and placed AoEs. Channeled AoEs like Machinist's Flamethrower and Blue Mage's Apocalypsis takes every second, but they tick based on the Machinist or Blue Mage and not the target. Using Blue Mage's Stud Tram as a damage comparison, we can also see that Apocalypsis scales with spell speed for bonus damage, so it is indeed considered a dot as far as the game is concerned. Placed AoEs actually take every 3 seconds like dots and hots, but when placed, they hit an extra time right at the start to initiate the effect on anything that was already there. This means, for example, that Ninja's Doton can hit once right when you place it and then again almost immediately after, depending on when the dot tick happens. I will simply leave it at that though, but if you think you have an example of a dot or a hot that does in fact not tick every 3 seconds specifically, then I would love to hear about it. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact: technically, Red Mage's enchanted Redoublement scales with skill speed, as the real limiter here is that the minimum speed can reduce an action's GCD to is 1.5 seconds. Uniquely among the 1-2-3 combo of Red Mage, Redoublement has a GCD of 2.2 seconds, where the 2 prior steps are exactly 1.5. However, don't put skill speed on your Red Mages, everyone.